This program was funded in part by Independent Health, the University at Buffalo Academic Health Center, and its School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences, and the James H. Cummings Foundation. Additional support provided by the Baird Foundation, the Peter C. Cornell Trust, Gelia Wells and Mohr, the M&T Charitable Foundation, the John R. Oishei Foundation, the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus, and by the members of WNED. Thank you.
When I was a kid, a teenager, I wanted to study mathematics in high school and in college, but my father was not so keen about that. I mean, he said, what can you do once you have become an expert mathematician? Why don't you think of becoming a doctor? I told him I really wasn't interested in having a medical career. And so my father, who was not very happy with that decision, nevertheless went along with it. And in a sense, he was right. I mean, his ideas made sense. My ideas did not. But you know what it's like with a teenager. And after all, what do fathers know? I think they have better orange juice squeezes nowadays, but this is an old one.
Should I take your vitamins out?
Yes, you do.
What do you want?
Nobel laureate Dr. Herbert Hauptman is a mathematician.
There you are.
He and his wife Edith live in Buffalo, New York, and have been married for 67 years.
Thank you.
That's what I do every morning.
In 1985, he and a partner, Jerome Karl, won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their work in crystallography. And at 91, Hauptman continues to go to work every day at the research institute that now bears his name.
I go in every day, yes. Nowadays I don't drive anymore, so I catch a cab, going and coming.
Every day is a new, interesting challenge. Every day is still exciting for him. You know, until everything, the machinery stops dead in its tracks, he's going to be coming in every day.
After winning the Nobel Prize, Hauptman had more than a few opportunities to go anywhere in the country. He chose to stay in Buffalo.
Some people think I'm crazy for staying around in Buffalo all these years, but I had a different view of it.
He became part of this community, and he made a conscious decision that he wanted to stay here.
I probably could have found some sort of a job in the Washington area, but I was very well satisfied with the work that I was doing here. And it turned out to be a very good decision, although at the time that it was made, we didn't really know how it would work out.
I love this one, Herb and his whites. I think Herb looks so young here, doesn't he? I thought he was handsome. But I didn't know he was as smart as he turned out to be.
Herbert Hauptman, the oldest of 3 children, was born into a working-class home in the Bronx in 1917. He was quiet, studious, and extraordinarily modest. And at 13, while most other kids were playing ball and idolizing people like Babe Ruth and Lefty Grove, Hauptman had other interests.
I think of my brother, who was a year and a half younger than me. He was a more typical kid in the sense that when we came home from school, he would be out playing ball. I don't think I ever did that.
Instead, he was at the library reading the philosophy of Bertrand Russell and French math books by Patrice de Fermat. Not your typical fare for a teenager.
I love to read the stuff that he wrote. He was the first one to rectify a curve. I thought that was great. And mathematicians have thought that it's impossible ever to rectify a curve. He said, but he succeeded in doing it. Well, it was stories like this that I found very fascinating. when I read these stories, I couldn't put the book down.
You mean none of you have been curious enough to look for more examples? Would you be surprised to know that there are...
When you think that a Nobel laureate or a man with his status is harder to approach, but it's not the case. And he also went regularly go to the high schools to give these high school students a lecture about how important the science is, how important the mathematics to the science is.
I think what happens nowadays when kids get through high school, they still haven't learned how to think. The course, the material, which stresses, in fact, which consists of teaching people how to think, is mathematics.
Then put a number in here, and then make
I was gonna
put a
say.
number there.
Do you mean to tell me, what does it say?
My parents, both of them, felt that the best thing they could do for their three sons was to ensure that they got the best education that they could and went as far as they were able to go. And they insisted on that.
Hauptman entered City College in New York during the pit of the Depression. It was a perfect fit for a poor boy from the Bronx with an exceptional mind because tuition was free and only the best students were accepted.
I wanted to carry on and work for an advanced degree. And so I registered for my master's degree at Columbia University. The cost of tuition was just $90. My parents we didn't have the $90. Well, my parents did have $90. It was their life savings. And they paid it.
He followed the interests that we had, and it made it so I could feel smart about something. He came home with this album that was for children, and it was space songs. There's a fondness about that because I link it to my dad.
Venus.
Which one has a ring?
Saturn.
Which one is nearest the sun?
I do know how they met, but I don't know how long they knew each other before they got married.
This is a nice song.
Maybe everyone thinks their parents' relationship is special and different. But I happen to think that my parents' relationship is different from a lot of others because of my father.
Edith and Herb Hauptman married just weeks after they first met. They've been together now for 67 years.
We met in Washington. Both of us had jobs at the 1940 Census Bureau. And so we would go to work together, both of us at the Census Bureau. Those were good days. And on weekends, we would drive out, we would cycle out to Greenbelt, remember?
Yes, I remember.
Yeah.
We had bicycles then.
Yeah.
No car.
No car.
But we got around on our bikes.
We had a choice. We had $50, and we could have bought a car or two bikes. A used car or two bikes. And we chose the two bikes.
We were young then,
Yeah.
didn't really know any better.
Yeah.
In 1942, 2 years after they were married, Hauptman enlisted as an officer in the Navy and was stationed in the Pacific. The experience changed him forever.
Well, it may be opposed to just about any kind of war at all. I have very strong feelings about that. The big lesson you learn from being in a war situation is that life becomes very cheap. Hardly anyone would be surprised if he didn't survive that day. Being in such a situation is good for no one, and it's interesting to see how different people cope. What I did was I took with me one of my favorite books, Wilson's Advanced Calculus. And every evening, I had a plan. For 18 months that I was overseas, I simply read another couple of pages in that book and did a few problems, worked out a few problems. And that made it possible for me to get by.
In 1946, after a year and a half overseas, he returned to the States and to Edith. It was a busy time. He was attending the University of Maryland for his PhD in math. By 1947, he was working at the Naval Research Lab in Washington, D.C. as a research scientist, and he and Edith were raising two daughters, Barbara and Carol.
And here are the girls at the beach. We used to like to go to Bethany Beach. The waves were very high, and there's Carol buried. Here the girls were quite young. I guess Carol looks like she was talking.
He loved doing stuff with us. And it wasn't like it was an obligation. I never felt that, oh, he needs to rush back and be working. He never went into the office on the weekends. That never intruded. We always came first.
So do you remember singing these songs on the way to the zoo?
Oh, I do. On the way to Mandalay,
Where the
flying fishes play, and the dawn comes up like thunder, out of China across the bay.
At the Naval Research Lab, Hauptman was working with Jerome Carl, a chemist and former classmate at City College. Carl introduced him to a bewildering problem in chemistry, one that he'd been working on, one that had been puzzling researchers for decades, determining the shapes of molecules. Molecules are the building blocks of life, and knowing their shapes determines how they function. And knowing how they function gives scientists a greater understanding of all life processes and clearer insight into the causes of disease. Determining the shapes requires a complex process called crystallography. Since 1912, chemists had known that a beam of X-rays directed toward a crystal is scattered when it strikes atoms, and the scattered radiation forms a diffraction pattern. The problem for chemists was how to work backward from the diffraction pattern to the three-dimensional structure of the molecules. Solving even the simplest molecule with only a few atoms could take months or years of educated guesswork. And because the problem was so complex, the scientific community was resigned to the belief that there was no solution. But Hauptman wasn't so sure. He was certain that the answer didn't lie in chemistry, but was embedded in math. And reminiscent of his favorite mathematician, Fermat, who convinced a skeptical world of his mathematical theories, Hauptman set out to do the same.
People said, this is crazy, this will never work. Because when he first started to work in this area, one has to know that the majority of the researchers thought that the work would lead to nowhere.
And all I had to hear, that here was a problem that no one could solve. For not only that, but was even impossible to solve in principle. And once I heard that, then there was no letting it go.
It was 1947, and Hauptman knew that he was onto something important. And with nothing more than pencil, paper, his mind, and dogged determination, he pursued the answer. And his gritty persistence soon paid off when he solved a very simple three-dimensional structure using a complex mathematical formula he called the direct methods. And he was confident that other, even larger structures could be solved the same way.
So by means of this one example, I was able to prove conclusively that the general crystallographic community was all wrong. They were absolutely wrong in stating that this was a problem with no solution.
By 1953, Hauptman and Carl had written an abstract that presented Hauptman's theories to the world. But to a community of skeptical chemists and crystallographers, the results seemed dubious.
The ones who criticized it claimed that we were making some assertions which would have been impossible to justify, and we were open to criticism, and we were criticized.
And there was a lot of resentment among the crystallographers when he tried to do this, because it seemed wrong to come at this problem from a mathematical point of view. You should be doing it from chemistry.
Undaunted, Hauptman pressed on, determined to silence the critics.
These are people whom I have an enormous admiration for, because at some stage in their life, and often very early on, they've decided that there is something extremely important that they want to know about, and they pursue it come hell or high water.
Hauptman worked at the Naval Research Lab for 23 years, laboring for the most part on the crystallography problem. But in 1970, and at the height of the Vietnam War, he reached a defining moment in his life and career.
I felt the pressure to shift the emphasis of my work, and I did not like that idea. Because the work that was suggested for me to do, for example, was to develop guided missiles which would shoot down incoming missiles, and that work of that sort. And I was philosophically opposed to doing that.
That opposition brought him to Western New York and the Medical Foundation of Buffalo. It was at the offer of his friend, Dorita Norton, who was equally as convinced as Hauptman that he was headed in the right direction with his research.
And Dorita believed that he knew what he was talking about. And in fact, it was her vision to bring him to Buffalo, to give him the ability to continue to do his work, that eventually led to establishing the base for what becomes his Nobel Prize.
And this is the tetrahedron, and as you can see, it's really a very attractive piece of work. It consists of
For many, mathematics is at best drudgery, but Hauptman transforms it into works of art.
This is the cube, one cube in another. This is the octahedron. This has 8 triangular faces, and you can see it's really very nice.
The beauty of the mathematics, the harmony that you see in the equations, the symmetry, it's extremely beautiful. There's a side that is enormously aesthetically pleasing.
This is a 4-dimensional tetrahedron projected into 3 space, and then the idea to fill them with spheres occurred to me when I made...
So he's kind of a Renaissance person in that his interests range a lot over a very wide area. And as a mathematician, it's an anchor point for a lot of things. He's a great interest in music and always is listening to classical music.
I always wanted to learn to play the violin. And finally, when I got to be around 18, I had gotten into a string quartet. And I've always thought that I could have made a career out of playing chamber music.
This is a metronome. It's the metronome that I used when I was 18, 19 years old and was starting to learn to play the violin. I used that metronome, and it's just survived. In fact, even my fiddle has survived someplace, although I never use it anymore. It's down in the basement here.
By the time that Hauptman arrived at the Medical Foundation in 1970, his work was just beginning to be understood by chemists and crystallographers. But it wasn't until 1985, after almost 4 decades of research, that he was finally recognized for the groundbreaking work he'd spent the better part of his life on, the mathematical equation called direct methods.
I'd like to show you particularly, this is the one Dr. Hauptman gave me, and he said that this is what he did when he was doing the research in direct methods. These are his handwriting, so I made a Xerox copy. This is a very, variable manuscript. You can see how many different formulas and mathematical equations and integrations and a lot of things which are used in the derivation of original direct methods for X-ray crystallography.
The most exciting day about the research is when you make the discovery and when you see that what you've been thinking about is real, and you suddenly are able to, all the ideas you had come together and you say, oh yes, this works. This is the moment, the eureka moment. And that comes long before the Nobel Prize. Herb knew the value of what he had done. He knew who he was and what he had done. The prize was just frosting on the cake.
Dr. Hauptman got his award in the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work on molecular structure shaping. It was his efforts.
Chemists and crystallographers now had a tool to effectively determine a molecule's three-dimensional shape. Today, Hauptman's direct methods, combined with powerful new computing techniques, have removed the guesswork and reduced a job that once took months or years to hours and minutes.
30 years ago, it's rare to solve a structure with, say, more than 100 atoms. Okay, these days, with the modern technology, solving a protein structure, say, containing more than 10,000 atoms is possible.
Hauptman had brought about a fundamental change in the understanding of the causes of disease. That, in turn, has allowed scientists to design new drugs that specifically target illnesses like cancer, HIV, and heart disease.
As time will go by, people will look back and say, there was a period before the work that Hauptman and Carl did, and a period after. And that period after will be characterized by much more rapid drug design, much more ambitious kinds of attacks on disease, and we'll be able to point back to this work, this seminal work, and say, this was a big, big change in the way that we could do business.
And that's why they got the Nobel Prize, because you have to do something that's going to change the whole paradigm of science, and it has.
This is Nobel himself, and here we're at this is the Queen, at the big banquet.
Herbert Hauptman, an exceedingly modest man, is first to receive his award.
My wife kept thinking, that maybe this could happen. I tried to assure her that it was out of the question. And the reason that I thought it was out of the question is no mathematician had ever won the prize for the work that he did in mathematics. As it turned out, I was right, but she was even more right.
Just watching my dad, I mean, it was, what can you say? You couldn't be more proud. And I went up and I hugged my dad, and that to me was important. It was a special spot for me with my dad right then. Because at that point, I felt my dad kind of became the world.
That day, a modest kid from the Bronx did become the world. In 1994, the Medical Foundation was renamed the Hauptman Woodward Medical Research Institute, and as part of the emerging Buffalo-Niagara Medical Campus, it's become recognized globally as a leader in the science of X-ray crystallography.
That all goes back to Herb having made a major center of crystallography be here to create something that is indeed, it is unique in the world.
Over 15,000 crystallographers in 70 countries are using Hauptman's direct methods for drug-related design to improve people's health worldwide.
To the extent that Buffalo supports research in the life sciences, this is going to be a good thing, not only for Buffalo, but for the science in general. So, if we can simply do that, carry on, and learn more and more about living things, I feel that my goal, whatever it has been, and it's related to that, has been more or less accomplished now.
His name will probably be amongst those names that we'll still be reading about in 50 to 100 years' time. You know, most of us in science are mere laborers in the vineyard. We'll be forgotten in the next generation, but some live on forever.
Music has always been a great influence. It's been a big mystery to me why it works the way it does. Where? It'll be fun to open that case after, I don't know how long, it's been at least 40 years, maybe more, I don't know. Well, I finally got around to learning how to play the violin. Then I had to go out and work, and I had no time for music. Oh, golly. I remember I used to open this every day. Now, let's see what this is like. Oh, look at this. All molded. I was hoping I would just be able to take it out and start playing again, but as you can see, it's out of the question. Unplayable. You do have to recognize there's only so much one can do in one's own lifetime, and the time comes when you have to let go and let others take over. For me, I think that time has pretty much come.
This program was funded in part by Independent Health, the University at Buffalo Academic Health Center, and its School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences, and the James H. Cummings Foundation. Additional support provided by the Baird Foundation, the Peter C. Cornell Trust, Gelia Wells and Mohr, the M&T Charitable Foundation, the John R. Oishei Foundation, the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus, and by the members of WNED. Thank you.